Thank you, Jean-Marie. I think this is the point that we decided to switch with Jean-Marie because, as you see, personnel cost takes a huge amount of this presentation because actually it presents a huge amount of the errors that we find in the cost statements. Now, why did we decide to switch here? I think the personnel cost was divided into two parts. The actual ones, which were the old ones we knew and we audited and we know how to deal with them. And I would say the saga of the average personnel cost, because it was really a saga on our end. And I will start it with FP6 because this is an important thing to understand. FP6 did not allow for the use of average personnel costs. Of course, many of our beneficiaries use those average personnel costs as their usual accounting practice, and they were right in saying, well, Commission, why all of a sudden you do not allow me to use it? So in FP7, we made a huge step forward, and we said, yes, we should listen to the persons that we pay the grants to, and we should do something to allow for the use of average personnel costs. We should do that, but we should do this in the usual Commission way, controlled way. So we started with inventing a rule and with inventing a specifically custom-made ex-ante certificate for average personnel cost. And in our rules we said, yes, you may use your average personnel cost if you have a certificate on the average personnel cost. And this certificate will be granted if the average personnel costs that you use do not significantly deviate from your actuals. And this is where our problem started. So we had to define the word significant. It took us years on end to define what significant was for us, for the DGs that were related to this, to the code, and so on and so forth. So finally we came with a midway solution. And as usual, midway solutions are no good for anybody. So there was a solution in which we said, yes, we would grant those participants who use average personnel cost a certificate, given that there is a deviation between average personnel cost and actual personnel cost, not exceeding 25%. Well, we started analyzing, we started having certificates applications flooding in, we started analyzing them, and then we saw that understanding of deviation was as broad as Europe is. And then we saw numerous amounts of average personnel cost systems which were really custom-made to fit this 25%. And we came into the other end of the problem where there was not anymore the usual accounting practice of the beneficiary because he simply needed to adapt it so that we can accept it. And at the same time, luckily, we had the communication on simplification. We did a lot of effort, and one of the simplifying acts that we took was the average personnel cost. And I can tell you it was a relief for us, and probably a relief for our beneficiaries that use this average personnel cost as their usual system for declaring personnel costs. So the criteria, I write new, but it is from January 2011. It is a criteria that is admittedly very, very broad. In basic terms, it says that we would accept the use of average personnel costs on FP7 grants, given that they meet 4 distinct criteria, very broad ones. First of all, that it is the usual accounting practice with the beneficiary, again with the disclaimer as long as it is not in contradiction with FP7 rules. The average personnel costs are based on actuals as recorded in the statutory accounts. So you may use an average personnel cost system, but this average personnel cost system has to be based on something which is a reality, an average of a reality of costs which exist. The third bullet point is a bit tricky to understand, so maybe I will try to elaborate on this one. It has 2 elements. The average personnel cost system has to exclude ineligible costs, but this is by default included already in the general rules that you should exclude everything which is ineligible and defined in the grant agreement. And the second part of this criteria is there should not be any double charging. And why do we say this? Once you're in the context of using an average personnel cost rate, many times you see systems where you have the rate, and in the rate there is a cost element which does not refer to personnel. This is why it is called an average average rate, average personnel rate, but it is a rate, it's not a cost. So you may have a rate in which you have an element of indirect costs included. I'm just giving you an example. So we must make sure that if there is an element of indirect cost included already in the average personnel cost rate, this element of indirect cost has not been included once again in the calculation of overheads, the total overheads that you would claim to the project. So this is the meaning of this bullet 3. First of all, non-eligible items are excluded, and secondly, make sure that whatever your average personnel cost rate contains is not claimed once again under another heading in our cost claims. And the productive hours. The productive hours, since Jean-Marie showed you that it is a denominator of this formula, it has to be verifiable and reflecting the usual standards that you use in your organizations. So these are the 4 criteria which are very broad, which are very simple to use for the beneficiary, and which are very, very difficult for us to verify. So after we came up with the simplification for you, we came up with the making our lives difficult in trying to figure out how we would check that all of these criteria, which are quite wide, can be verified, and then can be verified so that we can ensure that everything that we see in the cost claim is reliable. To that end, we imagined and we looked at the systems of average personnel cost that we have seen, and there are certain things that need to be checked. And I'm going to talk only about the checks which are performed by the certifying auditors. We must make a distinction between a certifying auditor who needs to fill in a report on factual findings and an ex post auditor who needs to do a full audit. So I'm talking in the context certifying auditor checks and FP7 checks. So from the side of the beneficiary, you're using an average personnel cost. What we expect you is, well, beneficiary, can you please show me what is your general system of calculating average personnel costs? For example, you may have in your research institute 3 categories of staff, senior researchers, researchers, and technicians. And you have 3 average personnel cost rates, 1 for your senior researchers, 1 for your general researchers, and 1 for your technicians. We want to see, first of all, the list of all the average personnel costs that you are using. We want to see what has gone into the calculation of this average personnel cost. So if you tell me, in my research grouping, I take all of my researchers in the institute, regardless of whether they work on EU or they don't work in EU, I take them from my list of personnel. I look at their salaries and I make an average of the salaries, and this is my average personnel rate for all of them. So we want to find out what is the underlying principle of or assumptions in deciding which rates to use and how to use them. We would like to see the groupings of the employees. Sometimes you have groupings of the employees, sometimes you have groupings of centers. You may have an average rate for, I don't know, the department, let's say, of mechanical engineering, and a different rate for the department of chemical engineering, and within this department you may have still 2 separate average cost rates. So you really need to show to your auditor what are the average personnel costs used in your institutes and what are the underlying principles leading to this distinction between the average personnel cost rates. You have to show us, as for the actual cost of productive hours calculation, you have to show us how you have come to determine this productive hours that you use for the calculation of your average personnel rate. And we want to see a list of the relevant employees which are included in this average personnel rate. With the example that we talked about the researchers, if you tell me, well, my average personnel rate is composed of 20 researchers, we would like to see who are these researchers. Are they there? Is there a criteria why you selected only 20 and not 200 which appear in your payroll? So we want to know how did you decide to use exactly this number and employees for the calculation of this average personnel cost rate. The auditor will look at what you have provided to them. He will look at what Form C has declared. So the auditor will see a senior researcher declared under Form C. He will take this researcher. He will try to put it according to the list of average personnel cost rates that was provided. So senior researcher, is he in the right group? Is he really a senior? Is he belonging to the group with senior researchers, has he been charging the hourly rate which is foreseen for senior researchers? So this is what we want to know. If you're in the case where you have a loaded, as we call it in our jargon, a personal cost rate which includes other elements than personal costs, indirect costs, we would like to make sure that this element which does not belong to personnel but it is claimed as personnel is not claimed in another cost category. So in the example of overheads, if we see a rate for the Department of Mechanical Engineering and the rate includes some elements relating to overheads, we want to make sure that these elements of overheads which have been charged already under the average personnel cost rate are not again in the pool of indirect costs appearing somewhere at the end. We will check, or the auditor would rather look at your productive hours calculation, see whether it is really based on the real situation at your institute, and then of course they will do a reconciliation of the claims to the accounts. I think here I will stop. I will give the floor to our organizers. Yes, I was going to say to our legal expert, but lawyers tend to speak very long and very exhaustive, so it's good to have a break before that.